Yeah.
Cool. Yep, now it's doing it.
Okay. Well, we'll start. Thank you all for attending this ACRL-Oregon webinar. I'm Ann Matsushima Chu, Social Science Librarian at Reed College and a member of ACRL-Oregon Board. Right now, your microphone should be muted. And if folks can mute the video as well, that would be great. Dr. Brooke Robertshaw will be taking questions kind of throughout the session and at the end of the session. So you can either unmute your microphone at the bottom of the screen and use that, or use the chat on the right-hand side of the page. Feel free to use the chat to ask any questions as they come up, and I'll be collecting the chat questions and sharing them with Brooke during the Q&A. Or if you have any clarifying questions, feel free to put that in the chat as well. After the session, when the recording is ready, I'll be sending out an email with a link of the recorded session and a session evaluation form. So we'd really appreciate it if you could fill out that evaluation so we continue to improve on these webinars. So today's webinar is entitled, What is Qualitative Data Good For? Quantitative Data Good For, I'm sorry. Throwing great big fusses about white colonial power structures. And this is going to be an ode to Ramona Quimby. Our presenter today is Dr. Brooke Robertshaw, who is currently the assessment librarian at Oregon State University in Corvallis. She has a PhD at Utah State University, where her focus was the use of quantitative methods in educational evaluation research. Brooke was 8 when she met Ramona Quimby. It was then when she realized that she wasn't the only girl who was thinking about fairness, who tried really hard to be brave, and who just wanted to be heard. In part because of Ramona's influence, Brooke began thinking about issues of justice beyond herself when she was young and got into canvassing for Geraldine Ferrero's campaign to be vice president. In her spare time, Brooke loves working out in skirts, lifting particularly heavy things, rowing, listening to podcasts, watching documentaries, calling out damaging imaging in the fitness industry, and making her own beef jerky and yogurt. Brooke is a second-generation academic and PhD, white, colonial American, documented, and cisgender woman. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with our community, and we look forward to learning from you, Brooke. I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Ann. Man, do you do podcasts? God, your voice is just soothing. And so I hope this is what you'll want. I have done another version of this presentation where the focus was more on methodologies. This focus is going to be more on assumptions and then what we can do with those assumptions. And the Ramona Quimby piece, I haven't chosen Ramona as the protagonist because we're a bunch of librarians in the Pacific Northwest. I wanted to make it less dry. And B, I think Ramona is just really cool. I'm going to talk about Ramona though, and I'm not expecting that everybody knows who she is. The other thing is if I talk too fast, because I will admit I'm nervous, and I'm from the East Coast and we naturally talk really fast, just say something. And I've never read Ramona, but she looks cool. Oh, cool. Yes, we're gonna chat a little bit about who Ramona is, Max. Yeah. Yes, us East Coasters talk fast. We really do. Thank you, Beth. So yeah. So you can see that I'm like pulling up the chat, and so if you have questions going as I'm doing this, just pop them in, because I'm pretty good just sort of on the fly. At least I think I am. I've been told I am. So let's see. Now I need to control this. So first thing I want to do is I want to recognize. I want to recognize where I am, where I'm situated, right, like where I'm sitting right now. I'm in Corvallis, and it's so I'm going to read this a little bit because I don't want to mess this up. It's within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or the Amphenoo Band. The Kalapuya people were forcibly removed from their land in 1855, and they are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. Ramona Quimby is from Oregon. She's a character of Beverly Cleary, and she grew up on Klickitat Street. I'm not sure where, which is named after the Klickitat people. The Klickitat people are from the Sahaptian tribe, and they lived east of the Cascade Mountains. Ramona, her street lies in the land of the Multnomah people, and the Multnomah people were devastated by malaria, and between 1830 and 1834. They are the members of the Multnomah tribe are now a part of the Grand Ronde Tribes of Oregon. So it's important that we recognize that. Let's see. So Anne already told you a little bit about me. But I think it's really important. Not a lot of people do this when we're talking about quantitative research, but this is who I am. These are identities that influence how I view the world. So I'm second generation PhD, I'm second generation academic. I'm an Episcopalian, so associated with the Anglican Communion. I'm cisgender. I'm documented. I could be a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution if I submitted my paperwork. So I'm colonial American. I'm really short. I'm 4'9", and that impacts how I view the world. I live with post-traumatic stress disorder. The other thing about me is that I'm really strong, and that also, all of these things impact how the kinds of questions I ask, how I view the world, how I move about in the world. So yeah, so that's a little about me. And then let's chat about Ramona. Oh, that's interesting. Every time so here's where, if y'all want to talk, like, please do. Because, so Ramona Quimby is a character that Beverly Cleary created. And Beverly Cleary is an author here in the Pacific Northwest. She was raised in she was born in Yamhill. She was born an hour. So if you're up in Portland, or if you're down here in Corvallis or Eugene, you know, if you're on the east side of the mountains, a little further. But Beverly Cleary is an Oregonian, and maybe all of y'all know that. And Ramona Quimby is also an Oregonian. And so what are the assumptions that we make about Ramona? For those of you who've read Ramona, what do you know about her? Oh, I'm gonna count to 10. So
I always assumed that she was white.
yeah,
That was an assumption.
So we've got chat. She's spunky. She looks white. So she's a precocious girl and a troublemaker. Yes, she is. She seems middle class. She knows her own mind. Oh, these are all really cool things I didn't think about. Yeah, middle class, white. Yep. Are the books? Yeah, the books are illustrated. So what you'll see throughout this presentation, and I've put. She grew up in a nice neighborhood. These are a lot of these. Yeah, nice in quotes. Oh, I love that. These are all illustrations from books. There's only one illustration that I've put in here that wasn't from a book from when I read. So I have a particular picture of Ramona and Lewis Darling, and then the second author. But yeah, so the books are definitely illustrated. Yeah, I don't draw. And so other things about Ramona, and I love, the precociousness. She knows her own mind. My thought is that she is middle class. That do her parents have a high school education? I think so. Yeah. That's never talked about. What is talked about is that her father goes back to school at some point to become a teacher. And then I think about her community, like who are her buddies? Who's she hanging out with? Howie and Willa Jean and Susan with the boing curls, and her community, and somebody kick in if you have different assumptions about her. But her community is very white. Just from looking at the illustrations. This is what Ramona looks like, and I've actually looked at illustrations to make sure that she's there are illustrations in these books where there are people of color, and they and that is distinctive, versus all the white blonde. So like Willa Jean is white blonde, is blonde hair, and I assume she has blue eyes, and Howie. So yeah. So who's her community? So these are the assumptions that I make about Ramona. And one of the reasons why I relate to Ramona is because she looks like me, or at least that's the assumptions. And yeah, middle class, parents who worked, all of that. So she's very much, at least my experience of Ramona is she's very much a default kind of character. She's a default to the norm in the United States. Yeah, but she also has big emotions, and she also thinks about fairness. So yeah. So this is Ramona, and so if I could like create a positioning statement of her and who she is: white, middle class. Parents have at least high school education. Father has a college education. She grew up in a white community. I don't know if she's got mental health stuff. She seems to be like average height. As somebody who thinks about that, she seems to be thin. So yeah, pretty default. And I'm not going to criticize Beverly Cleary for that. The first book was written in 1968. But the first book where Ramona was featured in was even earlier. So, okay. So now let's chat about Ramona's assumptions about adults and, oh, sorry. My notes are up there. What are Ramona's assumptions about adults? And I have this here. So Ramona and in my reading of the book, and other people may have different interpretations, but it's Ramona believes that Ramona seems to believe that adults are supposed to be fair, and for the most part they are, and that the decisions that they make are logical. They help with problem solving, and it's the idea of kids don't know as much about things as adults do, and for me, like Ramona comes into this story because she makes these assumptions. It's a very linear assumption. She knows that she doesn't always understand things. She knows she needs to clarify things when it comes to adults in her world. And to me, these are some of the same assumptions we make about quantitative methods. At least, maybe not among y'all, because y'all are listening to this talk. So maybe y'all have questions. Maybe y'all are thinking about quantitative methods the same way I am. But a lot of people talk about quantitative methods like they're completely logical. They're really great with problem solving. With the age becomes wisdom. I just copied this and they can help. So that's a longitudinal piece. So if we can look at quantitatively, longitudinally, then we learn more. So that's the age becomes wisdom. That they're fair, they're objective. I mean, how many of us hear that if we just look at the data, everything's going to be objective? And so these are the assumptions that I build my thought processes on. I hear the term data-driven a lot, and this decision was made because we had data, and so therefore it's a fair, logical, well thought out solution to the problem. And then if we have looked at data across time, it becomes even more valid. You're laughing at me. I do appreciate when people like laugh with me or laugh at me. Yeah. Not at you, with me. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, the notion that things are objective. So Max is saying, you know, it's funny that the notion that things are objective. Yay. Yeah, but this is what I hear all the time, moving about in the world. And even like last night, my favorite podcast, I'm a huge gymnastics fan. I've never been a gymnast, is Gymcastic. And they're like, we just need the data. Like if men's gymnastics would just look at the data, they would get more, they would get more people to watch it. They shouldn't be thinking about emotions. They should be looking at the data. And I tweeted out at them that data is subjective, you know, that emotions are just as valid. But this is what a lot of people have. These are a lot of the assumptions. And if you're hanging out in higher ed, I hear this a lot, and I see it a lot. So I'm gonna chat a little bit about how our assumptions were created. If you want, I've been doing a lot of work looking at history. So I started writing a paper about quantitative methods and bias in quantitative methods, and I wanted to write about the history. And I'm looking at all of these authors. I'm looking at Tukufu Zuberi, and I'm looking at Ruha Benjamin and Sophia Noble and Michelle Alexander and Kathy O'Neill and Virginia Eubanks, and they're all talking about history. And they're doing it within their, within these silos. So Zuberi is looking at race, and Eubanks is looking at, yay, Sophia Noble, yeah. And Sophia Noble is looking at big data, and so is Kathy O'Neill, and Michelle Alexander is looking at the justice system, and Crisaldo Perez is looking at gender. So they're all looking at history, but they're looking at it very, very much within their silo. And for me to really understand things, I needed to break out the silo. Oh yeah. You should check out Ruha Benjamin too. If you love Alexander, check out Ruha Benjamin. And so what I started doing was I just started gathering like all of this information, all of this history. And so how are our assumptions created? These assumptions about statistics and these assumptions that all of these defaults. So the Ramona Quimby default that she's white, how is it created? I start in 1619, and I'm not going to go through all of it because if you look at the side, that's just a screenshot of it. But the first census was in 1790, and that census that census counted, and I don't have my notes, but that census looked at white men and looked at white women, and then slaves. And then as the censuses developed, they started creating more and more like racial categories, and so it was white people with privilege, with economic privilege, creating the laws, who are creating definitions for other people. So the census was one way that our assumptions were created. And you can look at Walters and Anderson indigenous statistics, and they do a great explanation of the census and the impact of the census on First Nations people through the lens of Australia and Canada. And so we're going to jump around. So 1862, this book by Hoffman was written, Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro. And this is one of the first scientific pieces that I've been able to find. Yeah, thank you. And where Hoffman actually like takes what he calls us and you can't see me, but I'm doing quotes, a scientific view of people of color, of Black people in this country, and really describing it through a very white perspective. So that's 1862, 1869, hereditary genius. This is Galton, this is Francis Galton, and this is where Zuberi actually starts talking. So Tukufu Zuberi is one of my favorite authors in all of this. And History Detectives, if you've ever seen History Detectives, that is Tukufu Zuberi. So hereditary genius and eugenics. So that's Sir Francis Galton. The scientific charity movement, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Talking about how do we decide who gets help and who doesn't. And then some more assumptions. Buck v. Bell. Buck v. Bell legalized involuntary sterilization, and it was based in science. It was based on doctors saying, why should these people who are incompetent be able to procreate? And so there's a book by Edwin Black, I think his name is, I think that's his name. It's in the references. I have to put it in the references. So this notion that doctors can decide who is worthy of procreating and who is not. And then we start getting into the computerized era. The first computer was created, so the Anna Berry was completed. 1977, we're starting to get into personal computers. The Apple II was created. And then in 1998, I've looked at when does the era of big data begins? Probably begun earlier, but 1998 is when that term was coined. And so all of the, so for me, and if you look at this timeline, you're going to see that this timeline has imperialism and economics and politics and education, and it has activism. So you see over on the side, the Rural Organizing Project of Oregon was created. And so there's all this codification of the other into our society. And the way I tend to think about it is science normalized it. And that's what I'm talking about here is science normalized it and education perpetuated it. And what caused it was imperialism and militarism and government, but science normalizes this other. So, and here's some examples of it. So Virginia Eubanks, if you're familiar with her work, she's talking all about the poor, and she's talking about class inequality. And she talks about the scientific charity movement and how the scientific charity movement was a quote unquote data-driven movement back in the 1800s, where it was decided who would get, based on data, who would get services and who wasn't. Well, based on this, scientific charity movement back then says, people of color don't count. So who else is deserving? And those decisions were made by data. And I consider that movement still ongoing. And that's based on my reading of Eubanks and based on my understanding of the fact that data is collected, and then, then these government agencies decide who is worthy of getting help. They only count who they think is human. Exactly. And so scientific charity is still existing. And as we're seeing cuts in food stamps, we're going to see scientific charity, this data-driven decisions on who can get help, who deserves to eat and who doesn't, even more so. So then bias algorithms in the making. Y'all who read Sophia Noble, this comes from Kathy O'Neill, where some of the first algorithms, and I put that in quotes, was created to start ranking colleges and universities. And we all know about these rankings, right? And Kathy O'Neill talks about the first one that was created by US News and World Report. And Harvard and MIT didn't come out on top. So what they did is they decided that it was that their algorithm was wrong. Because the two that came out on top weren't who was supposed to. Colleges and universities quickly learned how to rig the system. She actually discusses one university that, see, and I'm checking chat as I go along. I don't have a war criminal category. No, I don't. We should chat, Max. Because I'd love, by the way, on the timeline, any feedback, it's not done yet. It is a work in progress. It will probably never, ever get done, but I'd love to get feedback on that. And I'm looking at my time. So U.S. News and World Report, colleges and universities quickly learn how the algorithm works. And so this is, again, not an objective algorithm. And then this next piece, I threw this in yesterday. And so there was a study done that looked at birth weight, and it looked at race and birth weight. And this was done in 2000. And so Vanden and Rowe are looking at birth weight, and they're comparing Black and white, and it's a data set, it's a pre-existing data set. And basically they go back to eugenics, and they go back to the notion that that characteristics about human beings are inherited because of race. And this has been disproven, but my point in putting this in there is that history is still impacting our work, is still impacting work today. And so they wrote this piece, and then Tukufu Zuberi wrote, he wrote another piece to, This Is Why You're Wrong. And this is a great quote: "The conceptualization of race is fundamental to all subsequent uses of racial data. Thus, researchers must be cautious when using race as a variable in demographic research." And this is what I'm going to get into now. So why does history matter? Why does all this stuff that I have started talking about matter? Well, with Ramona, the illustration on the right is Ramona thinks that Ramona moves through her world making all of these assumptions. And this illustration is from Ramona the past, and she assumes that her kindergarten teacher doesn't like her, that Miss Binney hates her. And she actually doesn't go to school because she thinks that Miss Binney doesn't like her. She also thinks that Miss Whaley thinks that she's a nuisance. She thought that Davy from Ramona Quimby, age 8, was really mean because he took her eraser on the first day of school sitting on the bus. She made all these assumptions about people, but we're going to find out what she does. But history matters because, and I love this quote from Bonilla Silva, when whiteness becomes normative, it works like God in mysterious ways. So how many of us, when we think about the work that we do, have this default category? Like the default category is white, or the default category in higher ed, the default category is middle class, or upper class. The default category is students who've been to school, students who are not first generation. So first generation it's more like a treatment category. So it matters because we've created a default, and everybody else is the other. And that default, and you guys probably already know this, but maybe you can say, well, I was listening to this talk, and if you need somebody to back you up, that the default category, having a default category means what we end up doing is we end up trying to change people instead of changing systems. That's my view on it. And Zuberi, I keep referring to Zuberi, but I just love his work. Bonilla Silva is all of these authors are amazing. And maybe I just default to Zuberi because I had a crush on him when he was doing History Detectives. I don't know, but his work is just so good. But these default categories then create the other. And the fact is that quantitative methods, as they're being used right now, are helping to further that. Quantitative methods normalize the other. So what does Ramona do? Well, in Ramona Quimby, age 8, we discover that Ramona gets the courage to actually talk to Miss Whaley. And, Miss Whaley, so when she's in kindergarten, she just learns that Miss Binney really loves her. As much as a teacher can love a student. But Ramona actually she goes and she talks to Miss Whaley, and she's got this mask on, and she says, "You think I'm a nuisance?" And so she interrogates her assumptions, which is just like, she's 8 years old. Look, she's just a little kid. and she checks in with her assumptions. And she actually has discussions throughout the books. She has discussions with her parents about some of this stuff too. So Ramona actually, oh, this is why I just love her, is she starts to question them. And she starts to learn that she can question them. I mean, she's an 8-year-old, and she's confronting her teacher about how she feels. And so this is what we need to do. So this is from Walters and Anderson. And so my experience of quantitative methods and working with quantitative methods and working with statistics is, and being raised as a PhD student, I didn't learn anything about epistemologies until I started hanging out with an amazing qualitative researcher, Steve Camisia. And that's what he talked about. I mean, he was deeply enriched. He was deeply embedded with folks like Foucault and Butler. I mean, every time I'd walk into his office, he'd say, Butler, Foucault. I mean, those were, yeah, okay. And so in qualitative, there's this very rich tradition of saying, this is who I am. This is how I'm looking at the data. This is why I'm looking at this. There's a very rich tradition of explaining ourselves. In quantitative, there's not that rich tradition. And even so, library sciences, so Andrew Asher and I did this meta-analysis that maybe some of y'all have seen. And so I've read a ton of those library impact studies, and I can't say for sure that none of them talk about their epistemology or their social position or their ontology or their axology, but the vast majority of them don't. Because I think I would have been pleasantly surprised if I had seen that. And so one of the things that we need to do when we're looking at quantitative methods, when we're using quantitative methods, is we need to talk about all of this. We need to be as upfront about our context as qualitative researchers are. Because this stuff is, as you know, as history has shown, and I could probably talk to you for hours and hours about the history alone, but history shows that we've normalized this othering. And therefore we can just assume objectivity. Well, I did my PhD in Logan, Utah, and in Logan, Utah, it's a very homogeneous community, right? I mean, it's very white. The LDS Church it's very Mormon, and it's incredibly homogeneous. And I would actually, near the end of my PhD program, I'd actually talk to my professors about, we actually have to state this. We have to state that this is a homogeneous community. Well, they were like, we're quantitative researchers. It's objective. And, they listened to me, and Mimi and Andy rock, but there wasn't that assumption that we needed to talk about that. And so what can we do? What do we do? If you're not a quantitative researcher, but you're listening to somebody talk about quantitative research, you need to ask them these questions. Like, how did you approach? What was your epistemology? What is your position? Who are you? What influences the kind of questions you ask and how you look at the data? Because quantitative methods are built on, we all talk about correlation, right? How many times those library impact studies are full of correlation? Well, Pearson was hanging out with Galton. Pearson was a eugenicist. So the guy who created the parametric test, the parametric correlation test that we use in social sciences, was a eugenicist. And so what does that mean? I'm not a statistician, but I know it means we need to question it. I know it means we need to be aware of the history of how this was created. So yeah, we also need to have conversations across research paradigms. People who are positivists need to be talking to critical race theory and critical, and feminist theory folks. And we need to figure out how to start these conversations. So if you know me, I'm like in your face, and I'm not the way to start these conversations. We need to find a way that challenges power structures in a way that those in power can hear it. So yeah, at Oregon State, we're lucky. The registrar is actually the registrar is great about this stuff, and they are like, Rebecca Mathern is wonderful about this stuff, and Allison Dean. But not everybody at Oregon State understands this and is willing to understand this. People in power think that quantitative methods don't have bias. And how do you have those conversations? And then how do we reframe it? There are statistical methods so Daniel Newhouse, who was at Oregon State for a long time, was looking at no longer using reference categories in logistical regression. I think we need to get, like when we compare groups, we need to rethink that. We need to rethink how we're phrasing it. We need to think about who we're comparing, and we need to think about why. I think we also need to think about changing our institutions instead of changing our students. I know we need to be doing that. And let's see, yeah. Yeah, they need to come out of the schools and into the communities as well. Yeah, so there's an amazing woman in Lane County. If you don't know her, her name is Mo Young, and she's the diversity coordinator for Lane County government. Everybody should know Mo. Everybody should also know Jessica Campbell for the Rural Organizing Project. But Mo is learning about this stuff, and Mo is, I actually got to go down and consult with her and do some stuff. But yes, so we need to actually bring this in, like, into our libraries, public libraries. So we need to stop comparing. Yeah. We need to rethink how we're using quantitative methods. If you talk to me, you know how much I love statistics. Like, oh, it's just such a beautiful language, and it calms me down. But we need to be really thoughtful. We need to be really thoughtful about how we're looking at different demographic groups. We need to have really solid reasons, not just because everybody else is doing it. So this use of race as a demographic, if you're going to do that, you need to be incredibly thoughtful about it, and you need to be able to explain why you did that. We need to share power too. And so I have a couple of friends, Susan and Sean Rowe, who are very much into the engaged scholarship, the community engaged scholarship world, where you're like on teams and you acknowledge, and Trimble and Fisher talk about this in their book. And this is where I first learned about it. It's not where I first learned about it. It was where I first learned about it in an academic context. You can put people on your teams. You put people on your teams from those populations because they know as much about themselves as you do about research, as you do about the work that you're doing. So you need to share power. Yeah, and look into community engaged scholarship. Yeah. Quantitative methods are not just about the numbers. Yep. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Martin, for pointing out this. Yeah, and people use statistics all the way to manipulate and alter data. They also, if you want to go read a critique of library impact studies, you can read Andrew and Astrid and I's meta-analysis. Just skip to the bottom, and you can read about how, like, there's a lot of really bad methodologies. I mean, let's not even get into the whole methodologies around the afterburn effect that Orange Theory of Fitness is saying exists. It doesn't. And I can do a whole nother presentation on bad methodologies and across the sciences. Sorry, I don't want to just target. I'm happy to target health sciences and those studies. But Andrew and I did a paper. And then the other thing is we need to normalize these conversations. So I see a lot of this work happening. So if this work happens in education, it's happening like here, we're going to go hang out within this like critical race theory. A lot of these conversations are happening outside of the general dialogue, and we need to bring them into, like, it shouldn't just be, oh, those critical race theories or the feminist theorists are doing this. No, everybody does this. Everybody talks about bias because it exists, and it's hurting everybody. I was an activist before I did my PhD. Are there segregationist qualitative researchers? It seems like I'm skeptical that we can change from other. Bias is a lot about power. It is. And so I'm like, yeah, it is. I think though there's some fields, like my academic discipline is education. And I don't know, I want to believe that education is trying to get better. I know the psychology is trying to get better. So I did a similar talk for Psychi last year. about this, so Psychi's International Honors. It's 2020. I know, it's 2020. I know, Max is just, how long will it take? Max, if you guys are watching the chat, Max is just like saying everything. It's 2020. What? So my mother wrote a paper 40 years ago. My mother has a PhD in ed research that Andrew and I cite in our meta-analysis, and she talks about, she and her co-author Erickson talk about the false meritocracy of higher ed. Well, was it 40 years ago? It was 83, so almost 40 years ago. And to me, it's absurd that my mother's paper from 1983 is still relevant. The false meritocracy of higher ed, it's still relevant. I mean, that's disturbing. Yeah, second, third, fourth generations, it is. It'd be nice to have some new blood. Yeah, come join us. Yeah, I mean, and I'm a second generation. Yeah, so no, and it would be nice if white people were doing this. So my view as a white woman is, you know, I call out microaggressions as much as I can, and I get people thanking me. And to me, like, you shouldn't be thanking me. You should just be saying, why didn't you do it more? Why didn't you do it sooner? If you're a person of color, stop thanking the white people. Yeah. And an earlier ACL, yeah, there are. Oh, hi, Amy. Yeah. There are a lot of connections, and there are a lot of connections, and this is like the end of my presentation. But there are a lot of connections between infographics and this, and with this presentation, I decided to go this way with the assumptions part, but there's a whole nother piece to it. And I wasn't aware that there was an early webinar on infographics, but yeah, there's a whole nother piece where people are misvisual. And I, like with my students, when I'm working with my students and they're visualizing a scale, I tell them they got to visualize, like, I'm really hardcore about visualizing the whole scale, unless you're making a really specific point and you point that out and you talk about it, because you need to, people need, like, if you're looking at change, a lot of my students look at change over time. You can actually make that look, you guys know this, look a lot bigger than it actually is. Or you can make it look like Oregon State has a lot more students of color than it does based on your visuals. And a lot of people are looking at those visuals. Yeah. So the visuals, I mean, the visuals are just, and there's actually, I think there's a book out there called Bad Science. I was talking to somebody at the gym yesterday. So that's my presentation. And I've been bringing in conversations, and it's 10:46, so I made it within time, and I hope y'all got something out of this. And if you didn't, let me know. Yeah, you can be blunt, because I'm really blunt with people. Yeah, for selecting option, qualitative findings do, yep, yeah, no, publishers don't like qualitative. Oh, and then at the end of this, you'll see, I have a whole bunch of references on here. And then if you look at my website, I've got more books. Yeah, so Martin, yeah, it's a lot of stuff. I don't know, maybe it's not as much. There's a lot more stuff out there. If you look at, and if you have additions to my timeline, email me. Because I think it's up to us. So you'll notice that on my timeline, I actually have this purple category, and that's activism. So that's why I've got like the Rural Organizing Project. The Rural Organizing Project, if you don't know them, Google them, you should know them because you're in Oregon. But like the Rural Organizing Project and looking at Black Lives Matter and even the women's right to vote, even though there are issues with that because God knows that was a white woman's movement. But look at that timeline. I learned, did you guys know there was a Black Wall Street? And then, I mean, there's people working to interrupt this. Yeah, and that's the nice thing about it, is that there is a lot, and I haven't featured that as much on the timeline because I didn't think about it. I was just trying to look at how how all of this has screwed people over. But there are people working to interrupt this stuff. And y'all are a bunch of them because you're listening to me babble about this. So yeah, so that's my talk. I can say a lot more about this. Yeah. And I'm glad I've caused you to think, Max.
Thank you so much, Brooke. We have about 10 minutes to take some questions, so you can feel free to put some questions in the chat box.
Or just thought.
Or if you have any comments or unmute your microphone, feel free.
Yeah, you have a soapbox. I just got 50 minutes on my soapbox. So. And then the other thing is, my phone number is on here. I give my phone number out. It's just who I am. But please feel free to, if you want to chat about this, if you want to just like have somebody to air your frustrations out, I'm happy to do that. You keep mentioning a part 2. I'm happy to do, so I did a presentation. Can you guys still see my screen? Okay, great. So let's see if this pulled it up. So I did, for Psych-Chi a year ago, I did this presentation, Emancipating Quantitative Methods from the Status Quo. It's similar. Open Ed research leans heavily on quantitative data. Do you have thoughts on using that kind of data with respect? Yeah, y'all are looking at demographic data, right, Amy? And it's been a while since I've hung out. Yeah, I think one of the things is looking at the modeling, like what kind of modeling is happening? What are the demographics? Is there demographic data being used? Is there, what's the error rate? What are the confidence intervals when you think about this stuff? What data is being pulled? What does the data look like? And Amy, I'm happy to chat with you offline about this and give you specifics, or try to or just brainstorm some of that stuff. Yeah. So I read a book about how Nazis studied US racist law. Yeah. How can, since racism is so, how can we somehow get out of it? I mean, the US is the best, it is the best in the world at racism. And Nazis didn't just study US racist laws. Nazis looked at a lot of the stuff that I talked about in the history. So how can we get out of it? Oh, that's a question for people like Linda Sarsour. I think for me, so that's, to me, is like a movement question. I wish Jess Campbell were here. That's definitely a movement question, but I think it's, if we talk about this, so every time we talk about this, and we have individual conversations about it, and we ask about researchers, like, what was your perspective? So next time you hear a library impact study being presented, ask them what their epistemology is. Ask them, like, and it may just be in their face, but bring these discussions into quantitative presentations. And they're not gonna, maybe some people aren't gonna do it, so maybe you need to be, like, they're not gonna know what to do with it. You may need to be super caffeinated, but ask them these hard questions. Yeah, and Amy, yeah, text me and let's chat. And when we show them data research, yes, Erica, you can like point out, like, do they talk about their position? So I'm not a statistician, so I can't talk to you specifically about the numbers, but have they been interrogated? Like, do they talk about their perspective, their epistemology? Do they talk about who they are as people that influences? What's their sample size? So then you get into a whole nother methodological question. And if you want to hear critiques on library science methodologies, and just do they use an effect size? And do they use a confidence interval around effect size? So one thing to do, and thank you for this question to trigger this, is stop using p-values, because p-values, I mean, So besides just the demographics, if you chat with me about like stats, like what's a stat Brooke always talks about? Effect size, effect size, effect size. Because effect size is looking at the magnitude of difference, not just that there is a difference. And then having a confidence interval around that then gives you a measure of preciseness. So how good is this measure? So, I mean, those are ways of looking at bias. Those are ways of looking at, by Beth. I'm assuming that's Beth Filer Williams. So, oh, it's good to see you, Beth. Yeah. So, yeah, effect sizes. And if they're relying just on p-values, nope. That's another thing you can look at. And then are they talking about who they are? So look back at, and I actually have it in here too. So this is the presentation that I did for Psych High. Yeah, so if we look at this Walters and Anderson, we need to be really explicit. Yeah, there is a lot of, yeah, so you can just like bring this up. Like, this is on my website. You can get access to this. And I'm happy to like create a picture of this without these questions, if you think it would be useful. But we need to be talking about all of this. For learning the lingo, the nomenclature, for some of these statistical, yeah, oh yeah, one of my recommendations. It's really hard. I learned it because I spent 7 years as a PhD student, and it just comes naturally. And maybe what you're making me think, Kathleen, is that I just need to create like a cheat sheet, like a 1-pager for some of these things, like what a p-value and why they're messed up, and sample size and why that's bad, and what's an effect size. Like, would that be useful? Yeah, so, okay. Yeah, so just like those 3 things that we could talk about exclusive, yeah, and statistics. And the other thing that I'll tell you about epistemologies is I actually don't speak epistemologies. I speak activism. And so if you talk to me about critical theory, I actually don't know what it is. But if you explain what critical theory is to me in everyday language, I then attach that to activism. So I have the exclusive language around statistics, but I don't have it about epistemologies. So my colleague Kelly is all about critical theory, but I don't speak that language. It's a very exclusive language, and my view about all of it, about epistemologies and ontologies and axiologies, soapboxing again, but is that basically academics have just taken the life experience of activists and they've academicized it, and they've taken it, and these are people that in the academy are saying we're breaking down the hierarchies, but what they are is they're just building it back up because they're just putting everyday experience. And that's a hardcore perspective, I understand that, but it's my lived experience too. But they're just taking people's lived experience. So queer theory is taking the work that Sylvia Rivera and did, and Marsha P. Johnson did, and putting it behind the ivory tower. I mean, that's my view about epistemologies. So I don't know if that answers your question and that gives you a perspective on my view of exclusive language. And I speak effect size. Does it help? Okay. It helps. I hope it helps that I understand what you mean. And thank you for reminding me that I use terms that is very exclusive. Like, I appreciate that a lot. And so I'm going to make a cheat sheet. Not a cheat sheet. I don't like that term, but I'm going to make a useful, like, like a quarter page thing. Effect size, p-values, confidence intervals. What is an axiology? Oh my God, I've forgotten what that is. Yeah. US education is all about exclusivity. Yeah. What is an axiology? I had this memorized. I'm sorry. Yeah, the nature of value and the things that we value. So yeah, US education is all about exclusivity. Yeah. So what are the things we value? How do we view And then epistemology, how do we view knowledge? And then the nature of being. Ontology is how we view people's being, you know, how I actually had to, yeah, but my expertise is only valuable if it's translatable, if people can understand it. Does that make sense, Amy? Yeah, thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it. But my expertise is only valuable. Yeah, hermeneutics. The nature of how we talk to people. So I recognize that it's 10:59 and we could probably interpretations. Yeah. No, and thank you for all of these questions. And before this ends, I'm actually highlighting all of this because this has been really helpful. And like I said, if y'all want to have this discussion more, text me or email me. I love this stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Brooke. Just to be cognizant of time, this is the end of our webinar. We thank you so much for joining us. And please keep your, please be aware that we'll probably have another webinar in March. So keep a lookout for ACRL Oregon's webinars. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much, Brooke, for being here and presenting your knowledge. We really appreciate it.
And Amy, connect with me. You know I love open ed stuff. So yeah, if I can help. Great. Thank you, Martin, for coming. I have a lot of respect for the stuff you do. Yeah. Okay.
Brooke, if you can just hit the recording button to end it.
Oh, thank you for reminding me that. Stop recording. Yes, I want to stop.